Hello and welcome to Quiet History. Tonight we are going to ancient Rome, not the Rome of emperors and marble, not the Rome of war and triumph, and the long theater of public power. We are going somewhere closer than that, to a single day. One ordinary day in a city of perhaps 1 million people, in a time before electricity, before glass in the windows, before anything softened the distance between a human body and the world around it. We will follow that day from its very first moments, before the sun, before the noise, before the city has remembered what it is, and we will move through it slowly, the way the day itself moved, not all at once, but in layers, each hour arriving with its own light, its own demands, its own particular feeling. Along the way, we will move between lives that rarely touched each other directly. A man of wealth and standing, whose morning begins with ceremony before it begins with anything else. A slave, waking in darkness, beginning work before the household has stirred. A soldier standing in the long afternoon, with obligations still written into his posture. A woman whose authority over her household is real and unrecorded in equal measure. A laborer eating at a street corner, while somewhere across the city, a senator reclines at a long table covered in things the laborer will never taste. These people did not live the same day, but they lived it in the same city, under the same sun, breathing the same air that smelled, depending on where you stood, of bread or sewage or sea wind or smoke, or the particular warm stone smell of a city that has been inhabited for a very long time. So settle in. Let the room around you grow quieter, and let Rome begin. Chapter 1. Before sunrise. Who really woke up first in ancient Rome? Rome did not wake up all at once. It woke in layers, and the first layer, the deepest and the least visible, belonged to the people the city needed most and thought about least. Not emperors, not senators, bakers. The baker's day began in full darkness, and we know this not from imagination, but from the physical evidence of Roman bakeries themselves. Excavated at Pompeii, their ovens still legible in stone, their grain mills still standing in the rooms where workers moved before anyone else in the city was awake. Flour was measured by lamplight. Dough was shaped by hands that had shaped it hundreds of times before. Hands that no longer needed to think about what they were doing. The oven had been stoked hours earlier. And now, in the last darkness before dawn, bread was already happening. Its smell moved into the street before the street existed as a social place. It drifted past closed shutters, past sleeping bodies, past the remnants of whatever the night had been. It reached, perhaps, the nose of someone in a room above, who pulled a blanket closer without waking, without knowing why comfort had arrived. That is how Rome's day began, not with power, with bread. And bread in Rome was not a simple thing. It was not merely food. It was infrastructure. The Roman state understood with remarkable clarity that a hungry city is an unstable city, and so grain was imported from Egypt, from North Africa, from Sicily, shipped across the Mediterranean in quantities that required fleets, administrators, ports, warehouses, and the continuous movement of thousands of people whose names history has not preserved. By the imperial period, a significant portion of Rome's population received a grain dole, free grain distributed regularly to citizens who qualified. It was called the annona, and the bakers who transformed that grain into bread were part of a system so essential that the state eventually regulated their profession, bound them to their trade across generations, made it difficult for a baker's son to become anything other than a baker. There is something quietly enormous in that. The smell of bread in a pre-dawn Roman street was not just the smell of breakfast. It was the smell of an empire trying to hold itself together. The water carriers were also already moving. Rome's aqueducts were genuine engineering marvels, 11 of them by the imperial period, bringing water from distant hills into the city at a rate that modern engineers still find remarkable. The aqueduct built by Agrippa alone delivered hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of water into the city every day. The fountains ran constantly, fed by this continuous flow. But water still needed to reach the places fountains didn't. Up staircases, into upper rooms, into kitchens where the day's cooking had already begun to organize itself. Carriers moved through streets that were still mostly empty, their vessels heavy, their footsteps among the first sounds to mark the stone. There is something specific about that hour, that particular pre-dawn quiet in a city that is, by any measure, never fully silent. The carts were still moving. Roman law, referenced by the writer Juvenal, who complained bitterly about nighttime noise, prohibited wheeled vehicles in the city during daylight hours to manage the congestion. So deliveries came at night. Grain, timber, stone, amphorae of wine and oil, and fish sauce. All of it moved through the city while its residents tried to sleep. By this hour, the last of those carts were finishing their routes. A pile of amphorae near a doorway. Grain sacks waiting at the entrance to a storage room. Timber stacked against a wall. The evidence of commerce, left in the dark like a gift from the invisible hours. And then there was the smell. Rome smelled. Every ancient city did, and we do history a disservice when we scrub that away. The smell of animals, of cooking fires, of the open drains that ran along many streets, of fish sauce, garum, which Romans used the way we use salt on almost everything, produced in workshops that ancient writers described as powerfully odorous, of bodies, of wool, of wet stone after rain, of the particular combination of things that only a very large, very dense, very old human settlement produces. In the pre-dawn, with fewer fires burning and fewer people moving, the smell would have been different from midday, cooler, quieter in its own way, but still present, still Rome. In the large households, slaves had already risen. Some had been sleeping in small rooms near the kitchen, in spaces excavated at Pompeii and Herculaneum that tell us, without sentimentality, how little room was considered sufficient for a person whose labor was owned. Some slept in corridors, some wherever the household structure allowed. Their waking was not their own. It was the house's schedule entering the body before the body was ready. A fire needed lighting, water needed heating, floors needed sweeping before the family rose. lamps trimmed, rooms arranged. The invisible machinery of a wealthy Roman home required many hands, and those hands had to be in place before the house officially began its day. This is a quiet form of inequality, not dramatic, not visible in the historical record the way battles and laws are visible, but real and repeated every single morning across the entire city, across the entire empire, across the entire span of Roman history. The question of who wakes first in any society tells you a great deal about how that society is organized. In Rome, as in many places before and since, it was not the powerful who rose earliest. It was the people who made the powerful possible. Outside, the street was beginning its slow return to itself. A dog that had been sleeping near a doorway lifted its head. Somewhere, a shutter was pushed open from inside. A figure appeared briefly in an upper window, looked at the sky, disappeared again. These small motions, these tiny announcements that the world was preparing to begin again. They happened every morning. In summer, when the sky lightened early and the heat arrived with the sun. In winter, when the darkness held longer and the pre-dawn air had an edge to it that made the body reluctant. In spring, when the light returned gradually and the whole city seemed to exhale from the cold. Each morning slightly different from the one before, and yet each morning, in its essential shape, the same. The bakers already working, the water already moving, the slaves already in motion, and the rest of Rome still suspended in those last minutes of the night, not yet required, not yet claimed, lying still in rooms across the city while the day assembled itself around them. Now the sky began to change, not quickly. Roman dawn was gradual, a slow withdrawal of darkness rather than an arrival of light. Deep blue becoming gray, gray becoming something almost gold at the edges of the rooftops. The writer Ovid described dawn with genuine attention. Aurora, the goddess of morning, her fingers touching the sky before the sun itself appeared. The Romans personified this transition because they lived inside it so completely. Dawn was not a background event. It was the actual beginning of time, renewed each day, and it arrived with enough slowness that you could feel it happening if you were awake to notice. Birds before the light was fully there. A rooster somewhere in the dense streets of the Suburra, Rome's famously crowded and noisy central district. Then another, farther away. The sound moving across the city in small waves, each one a little more distant, a little more faint, until it dissolved into the general quiet. In rooms throughout Rome, people were crossing the threshold between sleep and waking. Some lay still a moment longer, in that particular suspended state where the body has already returned, but hasn't yet committed to the day, where the ceiling is visible but the mind is still loose, where the night hasn't quite finished and the morning hasn't quite claimed you. That moment is the same in every century. It belongs to no particular time or civilization. A Roman lying in that threshold would not have felt ancient to themselves. They would have felt what we feel. The warmth of the blanket, the faint sounds beginning outside, the small, specific weight of what the day would require. And then, one breath at a time, the city gathered itself. The bakers pulled bread from their ovens. The water carriers reached the top of another staircase. The slaves completed the first tasks of the morning and moved on to the next. And Rome, that vast and complicated and entirely human machine, began again. Chapter 2. How Rome's richest citizens started their morning. A wealthy Roman did not wake up alone. That is perhaps the first thing to understand. Even in the privacy of his own bedroom, the morning arrived with other people in it. A slave entered before speech was possible. Water was brought. Clothing was laid out. The world began assembling itself around the body before the body had fully decided to join it. This was not unusual. This was simply how a large Roman household functioned. It ran on people, on the quiet, continuous labor of many lives, organized around the comfort and schedule of a few. And every morning, that organization made itself visible in the most intimate way possible, in the bedroom, before the first word of the day had been spoken. The garment that required the most attention was the toga. We know this from Roman writers themselves, some of whom complained about it with a frankness that crosses 2,000 years without losing any of its feeling. Martial, the poet, wrote about the exhaustion of the morning routine with the weary precision of someone who had endured it too many times. Juvenal described the social performance of the Roman morning with barely concealed contempt. Pliny the Younger, more measured, left us letters that describe the rhythms of his day with enough detail that we can almost reconstruct the hours. The toga was heavy, unwieldy, a single piece of woolen cloth, several meters long, draped in a specific manner that communicated rank, citizenship, and occasion simultaneously. There were different togas for different situations. The plain white toga of the ordinary citizen, the toga with its purple stripe for senators and magistrates, the all-purple toga of the emperor. Wearing the right one, arranged correctly, was not vanity. It was legibility. In a world without name tags or identification, clothing was information, and wearing it improperly was a statement you did not want to make in public. A slave whose particular skill was the arrangement of this garment would stand close, adjusting folds, correcting drape, smoothing the weight of the fabric across the shoulder, until the man inside it looked as Roman law and custom required him to look. Then the doors of the house opened, and the morning truly began. The salutatio. This is well documented in Roman sources. Martial wrote about it repeatedly, Juvenal complained about it at length, and Pliny described his own morning routines in ways that allow us to feel the texture of the hour. The salutatio was a morning greeting ritual, and it was among the most socially important events of a wealthy Roman's day. Clients came to the house of their patron each morning. Clients were not employees. They were not servants. They existed in a more complicated relationship than either of those words suggests. A client was someone who depended on a more powerful person, the patron, for support, favors, legal assistance, social advancement, or simple survival. In return, the client offered loyalty, presence, and the daily performance of respect. This relationship, the patronage system, ran through Roman society from its highest levels to its lowest. Even powerful men had patrons above them. Even the emperor, in certain symbolic ways, played the role of patron to the entire citizen body. It was not a corruption of Roman society. It was Roman society. And it began every morning at the patron's door. Imagine the scene. Not long after sunrise, a fine house on a good street, perhaps on the Aventine Hill or near the Forum, or in one of the quieter residential districts that wealthy Romans preferred when they could afford the distance from commerce. Already there are people waiting outside. Some have walked a considerable distance through streets that were still cool from the night. Some have been here many times before and know exactly how long the wait will be. Some are calculating, running through what they need to say, how to phrase the request, how to appear grateful without appearing desperate, which is a more difficult balance than it sounds. They stand in their togas. This detail matters. The toga was uncomfortable to wear and difficult to keep clean. Putting it on for the salutatio before the sun was fully up was itself a form of labor. It was the labor of performing respect, of saying, with fabric and posture and punctual arrival, "You matter enough that I dressed for you before I was ready to dress for anything." Inside, the nomenclator stood near the patron. This was a slave whose specific role was to remember names. As each client approached, the nomenclator would murmur the name quietly into the patron's ear, so that the patron could greet the client by name, appear to remember him personally, create the impression of a relationship warmer than the social machinery actually produced. The Romans did not consider this dishonest. They considered it practical. Social life required its fictions. Everyone understood the system and participated in it anyway, because the alternative, to step outside the system, was to step outside Roman public life entirely. What passed between patron and client varied enormously. A request for a letter of introduction to someone the client needed to know. A legal matter requiring a word in the right ear at the right moment. A small gift of money, the sportula, pressed into a waiting hand, enough perhaps for a modest meal, a token of the patron's generosity that was also a reminder of his power to give or withhold, or simply acknowledgement. Simply the experience of having come, of having stood there, of having been seen. In Rome, being seen by the right person was not nothing. It was a form of currency that could not be deposited anywhere, but spent in ways that were entirely real. The patron moved through all of this with practiced ease, or at least with the appearance of it. By the time the salutatio concluded, the morning had already advanced considerably. The sun was higher, the streets were busier, and the patron was ready to move into the public portion of his day. The Forum, the law courts, where cases were argued with a rhetorical intensity that Romans treated as both professional skill and public entertainment. The careful, continuous navigation of a city where reputation was built and damaged in conversation, where alliances shifted, where a word spoken to the wrong person at the wrong moment could alter the shape of a career. The wealthy Roman morning was not leisurely. It was dense, structured, full of a specific kind of social labor that left no visible marks, but required enormous energy. Meanwhile, in another part of the same house, a different morning was unfolding. His wife, and we should resist any impulse to imagine her as a background figure, because Roman sources, from legal documents to private letters to satirical poetry, give us women who were shrewd, capable, opinionated, and sometimes genuinely powerful, was managing the household that made all of this performance possible. She was supervising the staff, overseeing the accounts, because the management of a large Roman household was a genuine administrative task involving the tracking of supplies, the payment of workers, the coordination of many people doing many things simultaneously. She was making decisions about food, about guests, about the children's education, their tutors, their schedules, about the 100 small things that kept a large Roman home functioning at the level that status required. The salutatio belonged to her husband. The forum belonged to her husband. The public record of Roman life, for the most part, belonged to her husband. But the house, in its daily reality, in its actual functioning, belonged, in many practical ways, to her. 2 mornings, same roof, different worlds entirely, and somewhere below both of them, in the kitchen and the corridors and the service rooms, the slaves were still working, as they had been since before the sun rose, as they would continue until well after it set. Their morning had no salutatio, no performance of status, no nomenclator to remember their names, just the next task, and the one after that, in a day that belonged entirely to someone else. Chapter 3. The chaotic morning streets of ancient Rome. By mid-morning, the streets of Rome had become themselves. There is no other way to say it. The tentative quiet of pre-dawn was gone. The orderly beginning of the wealthy household was behind its walls, and what remained, filling every lane and alley and broad avenue with something close to controlled chaos, was the city in full operation. Rome at this hour was loud. We know this because Roman writers complained about it constantly, and Roman complaints, when they are vivid enough, are a form of historical evidence. Juvenal described the noise of the city with the exhausted fury of a man who had lost too much sleep to it. Martial wrote about the sounds that arrived before dawn and continued without pause. Seneca, philosopher and tutor to an emperor, described trying to think and write while a bathhouse below his apartment produced an unending inventory of sounds. The grunts of weightlifters, the splashing of swimmers, the slap of a hand on an oiled back, the arguments, the vendors, the occasional scream that might have been enthusiasm, or might have been something else entirely. The Roman street was not a background. It was an event. The physical structure of the city made this inevitable. Rome's streets were narrow. Even the wider ones that we might call avenues were modest by modern standards. The Via Sacra, the most famous street in Rome, the processional road that ran through the heart of the Forum, was perhaps 6 or 7 meters wide at its broadest. Many residential streets were considerably narrower, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass each other without turning sideways. And into these narrow channels, the entire apparatus of urban life had to fit simultaneously. Pedestrians, vendors, animals, deliverymen, children running, Old men moving slowly, slaves carrying burdens, citizens in togas trying to maintain their dignity, soldiers, priests, beggars, philosophers, tourists from the provinces, standing still in the middle of the foot traffic and looking upward at buildings taller than anything they had seen at home. All of them, at once, in the same street. The insula, the apartment buildings that housed most of Rome's population, rose 4, 5, 6 stories above these streets. Augustus had tried to limit their height to 70 Roman feet. Nero, after the Great Fire, set a new limit. The regulations existed because the buildings kept exceeding them. Landlords discovered that height meant more rent, and the economics of Roman real estate were not easily overridden by law. What this meant, practically, was that the streets were canyons, walls rising close on either side, so high that sunlight only reached the pavement for a few hours each day in the narrower lanes. Ground floors occupied by shops and workshops that opened directly onto the street, their goods and work spilling outward onto the pavement that was, technically, public space, but functioned in practice as a commercial extension of every establishment along it. A cobbler worked in his doorway. A fuller, someone who cleaned and processed wool, worked with vats of liquid in a space that extended past his threshold. A metalworker's hammer rang out from a workshop whose noise was simply part of the street's texture. A tavern's benches occupied whatever width of pavement the proprietor could claim before a neighbor's benches began. The street was contested space, and the contest was ongoing. The noise had texture, not just volume, but layers. A blacksmith's hammer from a workshop on the ground floor of an insula. The call of a vendor selling hot food from a portable brazier. And we know these existed because the charred evidence of Thermopolia, Rome's street food counters, has been excavated across Pompeii, their ceramic containers still set into stone countertops, their menus still partially legible on the walls above them. A teacher conducting a lesson in the open air, his students gathered around him in a public space because dedicated school buildings were not the norm, and education happened where space allowed. The bray of a donkey, the argument between two men that had started over something trivial and was becoming something larger. A woman leaning from an upper window to call something down to the street below. These sounds overlapped without resolving. They simply continued, layered one on another, until the city became its own kind of music. Not harmonious, not pleasant exactly, but alive in a way that empty streets are never alive. The smells had layered too. Bread still, always bread in the morning. Charcoal. The sharp animal smell of a butcher's stall where the work of the morning was already well advanced. Garum again, that fermented fish sauce that Rome ran on, used the way we use salt, present in almost every food, produced in coastal workshops, and imported in sealed amphorae that traveled across the Mediterranean and ended up opened in kitchens and taverns throughout the city. The smell of people close together, of wet wool drying in the sun, of clay and lime from a building site where work was already underway, because Rome was a city permanently under construction. The historian Livy described the city's expansion in terms that suggest continuous rebuilding rather than finished grandeur. The great marble facades that we associate with Roman power often concealed structures that were more complicated, more layered, more improvised than the official image suggested. Behind the white columns, behind the smooth travertine, there was timber and rubble and concrete and the accumulated material of centuries of building over what had been built before. Rome was always somewhere, under scaffolding, always generating the particular smell and noise of construction, the dust, the hammering, the shouted instructions, the groan of something heavy being moved by many hands. The street itself was an economic space of extraordinary density. For many Romans, the street was where work happened, not behind a door, not in a dedicated commercial district, but right there, on the pavement, in the open, in full view of everyone passing. A money changer occupied a corner with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent years watching people decide whether to approach. His table was his office. His face was his advertisement. The ability to read a potential customer, to assess creditworthiness, intent, and desperation within a few seconds of eye contact was his most valuable professional skill. For those too poor for a workshop or too mobile for a fixed location, the street itself was the business. Vendors carried their goods. They called out. They negotiated. They moved through the crowd with the fluid efficiency of people who have learned to read a street the way a fisherman reads water, knowing where to go, when to stop, how to make themselves visible without becoming obstructive. The Roman economy was not conducted only in grand markets and official spaces. Much of it happened in motion, in voices, in the 1,000 small transactions of a morning in which buying and selling were woven into the act of simply moving through the city. Children moved through all of this on their way to school. Roman education for those who could afford it often meant a teacher called a grammaticus, or a literator, who held lessons in whatever space was available. Sometimes a rented room, sometimes a portion of a covered walkway, called a porticus, sometimes simply an outdoor space where the students gathered and tried to concentrate while the city continued its business around them. A child walking to lessons in Rome would have navigated the same streets as everyone else, would have passed the same vendor stalls, heard the same arguments, smelled the same morning smells. Education was not yet separated from public life in the way that modern schools are separated. It existed within the city rather than apart from it. And that meant that what children were learning, letters, numbers, the texts of great writers, the speeches of great men, was being learned against the sound of hammers and vendors and donkeys and ordinary Roman life continuing without pause. There is something vivid in that image. A child reciting Homer while a fishmonger argues with a customer 10 feet away. Virgil being memorized against a backdrop of construction noise. The words of Cicero entering young minds in a city that smelled of garum and sweat and fresh bread. This was how Roman culture was transmitted, not in sealed rooms of quiet, but in the middle of everything. The Forum drew its own crowds at this hour. The Roman Forum, the Forum Romanum at its center, surrounded by other specialized forums that accumulated over the centuries as the city expanded, was the heart of public life in a way that has no precise modern equivalent. It was where legal cases were argued, where political decisions were announced, where citizens gathered to hear and be heard, where the physical presence of Roman power was most concentrated. Temples, government buildings, monuments, and the rostrum from which speeches were made, to crowds that sometimes stretched far beyond what any single speaker could actually reach. By mid-morning, the forum would have been operating at full intensity, lawyers in their togas, preparing arguments or conducting them with the full rhetorical force that Roman oratory training was designed to produce. The law courts were public spectacles as much as judicial processes, and a skilled orator drawing a crowd was not unusual. People came to watch, to evaluate, to be entertained by the performance of justice even when, especially when, the outcome was already being shaped by relationships that had nothing to do with what was said in public. Citizens on various errands moved through the forum with the practiced efficiency of people in a space they knew intimately. The forum was not a place you visited, it was a place you inhabited. For a Roman male citizen of any standing, being present in the forum regularly was part of what civic identity meant. Not just when you had specific business there. Simply being there, being seen, participating in the ambient life of the space was a form of social maintenance. You ran into people. Information was exchanged. The news of the empire, filtered through layers of gossip and repetition and deliberate distortion, reached the individual citizen at the forum the way news reaches people today. Imperfectly, partially, shaped by who was doing the telling and what they wanted you to believe. And then there were those for whom none of this was available. The very poor, the enslaved, the foreigners without status, the women excluded from formal public roles, the sick, the aged. Their morning streets were the same streets, but the city moved around them differently. A slave on an errand for their household moved through the forum without the right to speak in it. A foreign laborer worked beside a Roman citizen without the same legal protections. A poor woman navigated a street full of men who, by the logic of Roman law and custom, held a formal authority over public space that she did not. The forum's grandeur was real. The temples were genuinely impressive. The monuments were genuinely powerful. The accumulated weight of Roman history, expressed in stone and bronze and marble, was genuinely moving, even to people who had grown up seeing it every day. But it was built on exclusions that the grandeur made easy to overlook. The morning streets of Rome held all of this simultaneously. The splendor and the squalor, the powerful and the invisible, the marble and the mud, and through all of it, the city kept moving, kept calling out, kept arguing and building and selling and walking, until the sun climbed higher and the air grew warmer and the shadows shortened to almost nothing, and Rome, quite naturally, with the Mediterranean practicality that has never entirely changed, began to slow. Chapter 4. What Romans actually ate for lunch. By midday, Rome had grown hot. Not pleasantly warm, not the agreeable warmth of a spring morning. Hot in the way that a city of stone and brick and densely packed bodies becomes hot when the sun has had several hours to work on it. The rhythm of the day changed. The urgency of the morning, its noise, its movement, its appetite for transaction and appearance and public performance, began to soften at the edges. Workshops that had been busy since before dawn slowed. The forum thinned. Streets that had been nearly impassable became navigable again. Rome, in its Mediterranean way, was pausing, and pausing meant eating. Roman attitudes toward food and meals were genuinely different from what many people expect, and the differences are interesting because they reveal something about how daily life was actually organized rather than how it is sometimes imagined. The Romans did not typically eat a large meal in the morning. Breakfast, when it happened at all, was modest and quick. Bread, perhaps with olive oil or cheese, perhaps with olives or a small amount of whatever was available. It was fuel, not ceremony. Something consumed while standing, or while in motion, or while already beginning the day's first tasks. The main meal, the cena, came in the late afternoon or evening, which meant that midday, that hot, slowed transitional hour, was the time for something in between. For many Romans, that something was purchased rather than prepared at home. This is one of the aspects of Roman daily life that surprises people most when they encounter it. We tend to imagine ancient people eating at home, from domestic kitchens, as part of a household routine. And for wealthy Romans with large households and proper cooking facilities, that was sometimes true. But many Romans, particularly those living in the upper floors of insulae, did not have kitchens, or had kitchens so small and so dangerous. Fire in a wooden apartment building was a recurring catastrophe in Roman cities, that cooking was avoided when possible. And so they ate out, not in restaurants in the modern sense, but in thermopolia, those stone-countered food stalls whose remains are still visible in Pompeii and Herculaneum, their circular cutouts still holding the outlines of ceramic vessels that once contained hot food. These were not elegant establishments. They were fast, practical, present everywhere. Pompeii, a city of perhaps 20,000 people, had over 80 thermopolia identified in its ruins. Rome, with 50 times that population, would have had them on nearly every street. What was served varied. Hot stew, porridge, bread, olives, cheese, sausages, chickpeas, the specific contents depending on the establishment, the season, what was available, and what the customer could afford. A laborer at midday might eat standing at the counter, paying a few small coins for something hot and filling, eating quickly before returning to whatever work the afternoon required. The food was not refined. It was not meant to be. It was meant to carry a working body through the second half of a long day. For those with more time and somewhat more money, a kaupo, a kind of tavern or inn, offered something closer to a sit-down experience. Wine was available, sometimes hot food, sometimes a shaded place to eat it in relative quiet. Roman wine was not what we might expect. It was often mixed with water. Drinking unmixed wine was considered excessive, a sign of poor self-control. It might be sweetened with honey, spiced, or flavored with various additions. The result was something quite different from modern wine, and the Romans themselves had a sophisticated and sometimes contentious vocabulary for discussing its qualities. Water, meanwhile, was everywhere. The fountains ran constantly. Anyone who passed a public fountain could drink from it. In a city built on aqueduct engineering, water was perhaps the most democratic resource available, present on every street corner, free to anyone who stopped to use it. Now consider the difference in the midday meal across the city's social spectrum. A wealthy Roman at midday might eat lightly and at home, in the cool of an interior room, resting before the afternoon's business resumed. His food would be prepared by kitchen slaves, using ingredients purchased from the markets that supplied the city. The Roman markets offered a range of goods depending on season and supply. Fish from the coast and from Roman fish farms, vegetables from gardens within and around the city, meat, cheese, the ever-present olives and olive oil that formed the fat base of Mediterranean cooking, imported goods, pepper, other spices, exotic ingredients that demonstrated wealth and access to the empire's reach. A wealthy Roman's pantry was connected to the whole world. An ordinary Roman's lunch was connected to the nearest street corner. Both were eating. Both were pausing in the same hot midday hour, but the distance between them, measured in olive oil quality and the number of courses that followed, was vast. There was also the practice of the midday rest. Roman sources suggest that pausing during the hottest part of the day was common, particularly in summer. This was not laziness, it was practical. Working through the peak heat was inefficient and physically costly. A brief withdrawal into shade or sleep allowed the body to recover before the afternoon resumed. For those with the means to lie down somewhere cool and quiet, this rest could be genuine. For others, for the laborer on a construction site, the slave with no pause scheduled into their day, the vendor whose income depended on continued presence, the midday rest was theoretical. The heat was the same for everyone. The ability to escape it was not. But in the hour of greatest warmth, the city did settle slightly. The noise was lower, the pace was slower. The stone streets absorbed the sun and gave nothing back. And somewhere in the city, on doorsteps and in shaded corners, and in whatever cool interior space could be found, Rome ate its midday meal and briefly, imperfectly, rested. Chapter 5. Inside the Roman bathhouse. More than just bathing in the afternoon, when the worst of the heat had begun to ease and the city was gathering itself for its second act, Rome went to the baths. Not all of Rome at exactly the same moment, but enough of it that the thermae, the great public bath complexes, became, in the afternoon hours, perhaps the most socially interesting spaces in the entire city. The Roman baths are one of the most misunderstood institutions of the ancient world. When modern people think of them, they tend to imagine something resembling a swimming pool, a place for hygiene, perhaps some recreation, functional and relatively simple. The reality was considerably stranger and considerably more human. A large Roman bath complex was not merely a place to get clean. It was a leisure center, a social club, a place of exercise, a space for conversation and business and philosophy and gossip, and the quiet pleasure of being warm and wet in good company. The physical structure of a major therme was enormous. The baths of Caracalla, built in the early 3rd century, could accommodate perhaps 8,000 bathers. The baths of Diocletian were larger still. These were not intimate spaces. They were architectural statements on the scale of modern sports stadiums, and they served a roughly similar social function, gathering large numbers of people in a shared space for a shared experience. But the experience itself was layered in ways that a stadium is not. Entry to the public baths was inexpensive, sometimes subsidized, sometimes free during special occasions. This made them genuinely accessible across a wider social range than most Roman institutions. A senator and a freedman might not eat at the same table or sit in the same section of the theater, but they might move through the same sequence of bathing rooms on the same afternoon. This proximity did not erase social difference. It complicated it in interesting ways. The sequence of rooms in a Roman bath complex moved the body through temperature in a deliberate progression. You might begin in the apoditerium, the changing room, where you left your clothing and whatever you had brought with you, and hoped that the slave you had brought along to watch your things was attentive enough. Theft in the baths was a known problem. Roman writers joked about it. Several legal cases survive that involve items stolen at baths. People brought valuables in and sometimes found them gone afterward. The changing room was a place of mild anxiety beneath its social ease. From there, you moved into the frigidarium, the cold room, with its cold pool, bracing and brief for most visitors, a point of entry rather than extended stay. Then the tepidarium, warm, transitional, a place where the body adjusted and the conversation could begin in earnest. Then the caldarium, the hot room, steamed and close, where sweat came freely and the body opened itself in ways that made everything feel slightly more confessional. The heat was produced by the hypocaust system, an engineering achievement that ran hot air from a furnace through channels beneath the floors and inside the walls, creating a radiant warmth that modern heating engineers still study with respect. You could feel it through the floor. The tiles were hot enough in some rooms that wooden sandals were worn to protect the feet. The Romans did not use soap as we know it. They cleaned the body by applying oil, sometimes scented, sometimes plain, and then scraping it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. The scraping removed oil, sweat, and dirt together. It was performed on oneself with some difficulty and on others with more ease, which is perhaps one reason that going to the baths with a companion was common. Slaves might perform this service for their owners. Friends might do it for each other. At some establishments, attendants were available for hire. The strigil itself was a personal object. Roman citizens sometimes had their names engraved on them, and they appear in grave goods, suggesting that this instrument of daily cleanliness had enough personal significance to be worth taking into death. Beyond the bathing rooms, a large therme complex might offer an exercise yard, the palaestra, where men engaged in wrestling, ball games, running, or weight training before the bathing sequence. Libraries existed in some complexes, gardens, shops, places to eat. The entire afternoon could be spent in a bath complex without ever feeling that there was nothing left to do. And underneath all of this activity, the conversation. The Roman bath was extraordinarily good for conversation. There is something about warmth, nakedness, the absence of the usual social armor of clothing and formal setting that made the baths a place where talk flowed more freely than elsewhere. Business was discussed, gossip was exchanged, philosophical arguments were conducted between men who were sweating together in a hot room and somehow found this no impediment to serious thought. Cicero mentions bath conversations. Pliny the Younger describes his bathing routine in ways that suggest it was a genuine social commitment, not merely a hygiene practice. Seneca, in a famous letter written from a room above a bathhouse, catalogued the sounds of an afternoon at the baths with the precision of someone who was both irritated and fascinated. The baths were where information moved, where rumors acquired their polish, where the news of the empire filtered down through layers of social contact until it reached the man scraping himself with a strigil in a corner of the tepidarium. Women used the baths too, though the arrangements varied. Some large thermae had separate sections for men and women. Others operated on different schedules. Women in the morning, men in the afternoon. The evidence suggests that women's access to the baths was real, but structured differently, and that the social character of women's bathing time would have had its own rhythms and conversations. By late afternoon, when the light had begun to angle and the worst of the day's heat was behind, the baths were at their fullest and their most sociable. The senator and the shopkeeper, the soldier on leave and the student between lessons, the freedman celebrating some small success, and the merchant calculating his next move. All of them warm, all of them temporarily stripped of the clothing that announced their place in Roman hierarchy. All of them, for the length of an afternoon, simply present in the same warm rooms. The body remembers heat, long after everything else about a Roman afternoon might be forgotten. The particular feeling of warm water, warm stone, warm air, and the slow release of a day's tension into the steam that stays. And perhaps that is why the baths lasted as long as they did. Not only because they were useful, but because they were good. Chapter 6. A slave, a soldier, a woman. 3 afternoons in Rome. While the baths filled and emptied, while the forum began its slow quieting, while the city moved through the long gold of a Roman afternoon, 3 lives continued in 3 different worlds. The same hour, the same city, almost nothing else in common. Let us begin with the slave. The enslaved population of Rome was enormous. Estimates vary, and the sources are imprecise, but it is generally accepted that enslaved people constituted a substantial portion of Rome's urban population, perhaps a quarter to a third at certain periods of the imperial era. They came from everywhere the Roman military had reached, from Greece, from the Near East, from North Africa, from Gaul, from Britain, from the Danube frontier, from the edges of the known world. They did everything. They were teachers, doctors, accountants, secretaries, craftsmen, agricultural laborers, domestic workers, builders, entertainers, wet nurses, musicians, cooks, and everything in between. The range of work done by enslaved people in Rome was so broad that it encompassed almost every category of labor, that Roman society required. Some held positions of genuine responsibility and even informal power. A wealthy merchant's slave accountant might manage more money in a day than a free laborer would see in a year. None of this made their legal situation any less absolute. Roman law regarding slavery was extensive, detailed, and almost entirely oriented around the interests of owners. An enslaved person had no legal standing as a person. They could not own property in their own name. They could not enter into legally binding contracts. They could not seek legal remedy for wrongs committed against them by their owners. Their testimony in court was only admissible if obtained under torture, a legal requirement that tells us something precise and terrible about how the Roman state understood their humanity. And yet, Roman slavery, for all its brutality, existed alongside a practice, manumission, by which enslaved people could be freed. This happened with enough regularity that freed slaves, the liberti, formed a significant class in Roman society, with their own legal status, their own social possibilities, their own complicated relationship to the families that had formerly owned them. Some enslaved people accumulated enough informal resources, tips, small gifts, the proceeds of personal transactions conducted on behalf of their owners that left a little margin, to eventually purchase their own freedom. This informal accumulation was called the peculium, and while it had no legal protection, its existence was widely acknowledged. Some were freed in their owners' wills, a common enough practice that Roman law eventually had to regulate it. Some were freed for service that had been genuinely valued in ways that the owner chose to express through manumission. This did not make Roman slavery less brutal. It made it more complicated. The possibility of freedom, always present somewhere in the background of an enslaved person's life, shaped daily experience in ways that pure hopelessness would not have produced. It gave the system a particular character, coercive, hierarchical, dehumanizing in its legal foundations, but human in the messy and specific way that all human institutions become human when they contain enough people living inside them for long enough. In the afternoon, an enslaved person's experience depended entirely on what their specific role required. A household slave might be accompanying their owner to the baths, carrying the oil flask and the strigil, guarding the clothing in the apoditerium, waiting in the changing room while the owner moved through the warm rooms that the slave would not enter for pleasure. A slave in a workshop might be at the height of the day's production, hammering metal, weaving cloth, turning clay, cutting leather, operating whatever craft the workshop existed to perform, in conditions that varied from tolerable to genuinely brutal, depending on the owner, the trade, and whatever small protections custom or self-interest provided. A slave on a rural estate near Rome, sent to the city on an errand, might have something closer to a free afternoon, moving through streets with a degree of autonomy that their daily life did not usually allow, navigating the city as if it were, briefly, a place they inhabited rather than a place that owned them. That brief sense of movement through the city, unaccompanied, with a task to complete and the time to complete it, was perhaps the closest some enslaved Romans came to the experience of ordinary public life. They saw the same forums, heard the same arguments, smelled the same bread. But they saw it all from a different place, knowing that the return to the household was the return to a self that was not, in law, entirely their own. Now, let us find the soldier. Not a general, not a decorated hero of the legions. A working soldier, a Miles Gregarious, a rank-and-file member of a unit stationed in or near Rome during this particular period. The city had a significant military presence. The Praetorian Guard, the imperial bodyguard established under Augustus, was stationed at a permanent camp on the northeastern edge of the city, the Castra Praetoria, whose foundations are still partially visible today. Urban cohorts maintained order within the city. The Vigiles, the night watchmen who also served as a fire brigade, patrolled the streets and would become relevant again when darkness returned. A soldier off duty in the afternoon had options that ordinary civilians did not always have. Pay was regular, not generous by modern standards, but reliable in a world where reliability was itself a form of wealth. The city offered ways to spend it. The baths were popular with soldiers. So were the taverns. So were the gambling establishments that Roman authorities periodically attempted to regulate and never successfully eliminated. Dice were found everywhere Roman soldiers went, in barracks, in camps, in the ruins of military outposts, from Britain to the Euphrates. Gambling was officially disapproved of and practically universal. The Roman military was not, at the level of daily life, a particularly austere institution. Military discipline shaped even off-duty behavior in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes internal. A soldier carried his training in his body, even when the armor was off. The posture, the awareness of the space around him, the specific kind of alertness that comes from years of being trained to notice what ordinary civilians learn to ignore. He walked through the city differently from the man who had never served. Not better, necessarily, not more safely, but differently, with a particular relationship to crowds and exits and the positions of other bodies that the years of military training had made automatic. And the soldier knew things about violence that most people in the city did not. Rome was a remarkably violent society in certain ways. Its public entertainments in the arena, its military culture, its legal punishments that could include flogging, crucifixion, and death in forms designed for maximum public visibility. And yet most people's daily lives were not shaped by direct experience of that violence. They watched it, sometimes. They accepted it as part of the landscape of Roman life. But they did not carry it in their bodies the way a soldier did. The soldier in the afternoon crowd was moving through a city that did not fully know what he contained. He might stop at a thermopolium and eat standing at the counter, the way a laborer did. He might visit the baths. He might spend an hour at a tavern, playing dice with men he had served with, talking about nothing in particular, in the way that people who share a specific kind of experience talk when they are not required to discuss it. The afternoon was his. For a few hours, the obligations of the empire had loosened their grip, and he was, briefly, just a man in a city. Now the woman. Roman women occupied a legal position that was formally subordinate and a social position that was considerably more complicated than subordinate suggests. Legally, Roman women, particularly in the earlier periods of Roman history, were subject to the authority of a male guardian, a tutor, for significant legal and financial transactions. They could not vote. They could not hold formal political office. They could not serve in the military. The public record of Roman life was written primarily by and for men, which means that women appear in it less frequently and in more filtered forms than their actual presence in Roman life would suggest. But the legal picture was not the whole picture. Roman women could own property in their own names. They could inherit. They could run businesses. They could engage in commerce. They could initiate divorce in the later Republic and imperial periods. They could make wills. They could manage estates of considerable size and complexity. And the guardianship requirement was, by the later Republic, frequently circumvented through legal mechanisms that made it largely nominal for women with any resources or social connections. The actual daily authority of a woman in a wealthy Roman household over the staff, the children, the domestic budget, the social calendar, the physical organization of a large and complex home was considerable and real. An afternoon for a wealthy Roman woman might include receiving visitors of her own. Not the formal salutatio of her husband's mourning, but the social visiting that was as much a part of elite Roman life for women as the forum was for men. She might attend to correspondence. Roman letter writing was a genuine social practice, and women participated in it, as surviving letters involving women from Cicero's circle and others demonstrate. She might supervise the tutoring of children. She might consult with the household steward about supplies, accounts, maintenance. She might go out. This is important to note because the image of the Roman woman as entirely housebound is a distortion. Roman women of means moved through the city. They attended the theater, where seats were assigned by gender and status, but women were present. They attended religious festivals and participated in religious life in ways that were central rather than peripheral. They went to the baths at the women's hour. They visited temples. They shopped in markets. They were in the city, visible, moving, conducting lives that Roman satirists complained about, with a frequency that tells us the lives were actually being conducted. The complaints of moralists are historical evidence of the behavior they oppose. When Juvenal and others spent pages attacking the freedom of Roman women, the independent-mindedness of Roman women, the refusal of Roman women to confine themselves to the roles that tradition prescribed, what they were documenting, despite themselves, was a city full of women who were doing things. 3 afternoons. 3 entirely different experiences of the same city in the same hours. The slave moving through it without full possession of their own time, carrying the weight of a legal status that made the city's public life simultaneously visible and inaccessible. The soldier moving through it with the strange freedom of someone trained for a world that most afternoons did not require, carrying in his body a kind of knowledge that the city around him would rather not think about. The woman moving through it with an authority that was real and a freedom that was always conditional, always subject to the approval of a society that could not quite make up its mind about how much of both she was entitled to. The afternoon light was the same for all of them, gold and long and slowly tilting toward evening, the city unchanged around each of them, and yet each of them inside a different version of it. This is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to as we move through the Roman day. There was no single Rome. There was only the city, experienced differently by everyone inside it, shaped by status and gender and legal standing and daily labor and fear and hope and everything else that makes a human being the particular human being they are. And somewhere in all of those different versions of the same afternoon, the sun continued its slow arc toward the western hills, and the city, as it always did, began to change. Chapter 7. When the sun set in ancient Rome. There is a particular quality to late afternoon light in a Mediterranean city. It changes the color of stone. Rome's buildings, the tufa and travertine and brick that made up most of its actual fabric beneath the marble veneers of the important monuments, turned golden in the last hours of sun. Shadows stretched long and soft across streets that had been harsh with midday glare. The air, which had been close and warm through the afternoon, began to carry something cooler in it. Not cold yet, just the first suggestion that the day had a direction, and that direction was evening. The city felt this change in its body. The baths began to empty, not all at once, but gradually, as people calculated the remaining hours and decided it was time to move toward whatever the evening required. The Forum, which had already quieted through the afternoon, grew quieter still. Workshops began the process of closing, tools put away, fires banked or extinguished, goods stored or secured against the night. The economic day was winding down. But Rome had never been only economic. Evening in Rome belonged to a different kind of life. The transition was physical first. You could feel it in the quality of sound. The daytime noise, commerce, argument, the continuous scrape and hammer of a city maintaining itself, began to change character. Individual sounds became more distinct. A conversation across a courtyard was suddenly audible where it would have been lost in the midday din. A dog barking somewhere in the city carried farther. The rumble of a cart, illegal until now, but beginning to return to the streets, announced the return of the night economy. For some Romans, this transition meant moving toward pleasure. Cicero wrote about the importance of the convivium, the dinner party, with genuine feeling. For him, good conversation over food was not a distraction from serious life. It was part of what serious life was for. Pliny the Younger described his ideal evenings in his letters: dinner, conversation, a reading aloud of something worth hearing, then bed at a reasonable hour. This was not decadence. This was the considered enjoyment of a life that had enough structure to make leisure feel earned. For others, the transition toward evening meant something more anxious. Night in Rome was not safe in the way that a modern city sometimes approaches safety. It was darker, much darker. Oil lamps could illuminate a room or a doorway. Torches could be carried. Wealthy Romans going out at night would bring servants carrying light. But the streets themselves had no permanent illumination. The moon, when visible, helped. When it did not, the streets became places of genuine uncertainty, and uncertainty in a densely populated city with significant poverty and significant inequality tends to produce danger. So the transition to evening carried different emotional weight depending on who you were. For the wealthy, with servants and light and a secure home to return to, evening was a softening, a movement from the demands of the day toward the pleasures of the night. For the poor, and particularly for those who had to be in the streets after dark for work or necessity, evening was a different calculation. How to move, where to go, how to get there and back again without becoming the answer to someone else's problem. The lamplighters were already at work in the houses of the wealthy. Oil poured into lamps, wicks adjusted, the small circle of golden light that would make the evening possible, beginning its long negotiation with the dark. And outside, as the last of the sun withdrew from the rooftops, and the city passed into that brief suspended moment between day and night, that transition that belongs fully to neither, Rome prepared itself for whatever the darkness would require. Chapter 8. What a Roman dinner really looked like. The cena. The main meal. The event around which, for many Romans of means, the entire day had been quietly oriented. Roman dinner was not simply food. It was a structured social experience with its own rituals, its own architecture, its own relationship to time. It could last for hours. It could involve multiple courses, multiple kinds of wine, music, readings, conversation, performance. Or it could be simple and domestic, shared within the family, quiet and practical after a long day. The version depended entirely on who you were and what the evening required. Let us begin with the formal dinner, the convivium. In a wealthy home, the triclinium was the dining room, and its name already tells us something about how the Romans ate. Triclinium, 3 couches. Roman dining at formal occasions was conducted not seated at a table in the modern manner, but reclining on cushioned couches arranged around a central table. Diners lay on their sides, propped on their left elbows, eating with their right hands. This position, which strikes modern people as difficult, was considered the civilized way to dine. Standing was for servants. Sitting was for children or inferiors. Reclining was for the adult Roman citizen, engaging in the proper enjoyment of the meal. The couch arrangement was not neutral. Where you reclined told you and everyone else exactly what your host thought of your social position. The place of honor was specific. The least prestigious couch was also specific. A Roman arriving at a dinner party understood this geography immediately, and the social information delivered by their assigned place was as clear as any spoken judgment. A formal cena might begin with the gustatio, appetizers. Eggs were a traditional beginning, so common that the expression ab ovo, from the egg, became a Latin phrase for starting from the very beginning. Olives, vegetables, shellfish when available. Small dishes designed to prepare the appetite rather than satisfy it. Then the main courses. The furcula, dishes brought in sequence. Fish, meat, poultry, game. The variety and quality of what was served communicated the host's wealth as clearly as the house itself. The cookbook attributed to Apicius gives us a specific window into what wealthy Romans considered worth cooking. The recipes are complex. They use ingredients that required access to a global trade network. They are seasoned with garum in ways that appear in almost every dish. Wine flowed through the meal, but not without order. A host controlled the ratio of wine to water, and the proportion changed as the evening advanced. Getting the mixture wrong was a social failure that Roman writers treated with genuine seriousness. Between and after the courses, the evening might include entertainment, readings of poetry or history, music, the recitation of a new work by someone present, occasional theatrical performances. Conversation, always, was the real entertainment. The Roman dinner party at its best was essentially a long, organized, well-fueled argument about interesting things. Philosophy, politics, literature, the nature of the good life, the quality of the wine, the latest scandal involving someone everyone knew. And now, far across the city, in a room that shared nothing with this one except the evening hour, a different scene was happening. No triclinium, no reclining, no multiple courses. A family in an upper floor of an insula gathered around whatever space the room allowed, eating what the day's budget had made possible. Bread, olives, legumes, beans and lentils were staples of the poorer Roman diet, filling and cheap and available. Perhaps some vegetables, perhaps a small amount of preserved fish. Wine so diluted with water that its presence was more symbolic than intoxicating. The meal would be eaten quickly, practically, without ceremony. Not because these people had no sense of occasion, but because occasion requires resources, and resources were what this meal, by definition, represented the limit of. And yet, and this matters, it was still a meal. People gathered. Food was shared. The day was, in some small way, marked by the act of eating together. Even in poverty, even in a hot, crowded room with thin walls, and the sounds of neighboring families continuing all around, the human gesture of the shared meal remained. Smaller, simpler, but recognizable. The senator reclines on his cushioned couch and reaches for his wine, mixed just so. The laborer sits on whatever surface the room allows and tears bread. Both of them, in their different ways, eating. Both of them, in their different ways, done with the day's work. Both of them, in the deepening Roman evening, doing what humans have always done when the sun goes down. Coming together around food and letting the night begin. Chapter 9. The dangerous streets of Rome. After dark, when the dinner was over and the lamps had burned lower, Rome changed again. Not into silence, into something else. The night city was not the day city wearing dark clothing. It was a different city, operating on different logic, populated by a different cast of people doing different things for different reasons, governed by different rules, or sometimes by no rules that the day would have recognized. The carts returned. That law restricting wheeled traffic during daylight hours which had cleared the streets for pedestrians through the Roman day, was lifted at night, and the result was an auditory landscape that Roman writers described with vivid unhappiness. Juvenal, again, is our most eloquent complainer. He described the noise of the nocturnal city with the exhausted specificity of someone who had lain awake listening to it too many nights. The rumble of heavy wagons on uneven stone, the creak of axles under impossible loads, the shouts of drivers navigating tight corners, the sounds of delivery and commerce that continued regardless of whether anyone wanted to sleep. Marshall described being woken before dawn by schoolmasters beginning their lessons, by bakers at work, by the hammering of a coppersmith, by a money changer rattling his coins on a rough table, by the sound of a sick man's groan from a building nearby. The city at night was not quieter than the city by day. In some ways, it was louder. It was simply a different kind of loud. For those in upper rooms above busy streets, the night could be genuinely difficult. The buildings of Rome were not well insulated. Sound moved through walls and floors with the ease of air through a shutter. A family trying to sleep on the fourth floor of an insula was never more than a few meters from whatever the street was doing, and the street, after dark, was often doing quite a lot. But the carts were not the only thing in the dark streets. People moved through the night for many reasons, and not all of them were safe. Rome had no street lighting in any organized sense. A wealthy Roman going out after dark would bring slaves carrying torches. The torchlight would make them visible, announce their presence and relative importance, and serve as some deterrent against those who might otherwise target a single traveler in an unlit alley. But most people could not afford that kind of escort. They moved through the dark with whatever light they could manage. A small oil lamp carried carefully against the wind, perhaps, or none at all. And whatever alertness they had developed from living in a city that did not become safe simply because the sun had set. Mugging was common enough to be a recurring subject in Roman literature. Petronius mentions it in passing, the way you mention something everyone already knows. Juvenal describes the dangers with a specificity: the footstep behind you, the corner where trouble waited, the calculation of whether a shortcut was worth its risk. That suggests personal familiarity with the anxiety, if not always with the experience. The Roman legal codes contain specific provisions for crimes committed at night, with different penalties and procedures than daytime offenses. The fact that night crime required its own legal framework implies that it was frequent enough to have distinct characteristics. Roman law, characteristically, had thought carefully about this. The vigiles patrolled. These were freedmen, former slaves who had been manumitted, organized into 7 cohorts, each responsible for 2 of the city's 14 regions. They were stationed at posts distributed across the city, and their primary responsibility was fire prevention and response. They carried buckets and pumps and the other equipment of firefighting. They were also authorized to deal with nighttime crime, though the sources suggest this was secondary to their fire-watching function. Their effectiveness was real, but limited. A city of 1 million people spread across the hills and valleys along the Tiber could not be comprehensively monitored by any force the ancient world could organize. The vigils were present, watchful, reasonably competent at what they were trained for. But they were not everywhere, and the dark streets of Rome had more corners than any watch could cover. Fire was perhaps the more constant terror. Rome burned with disturbing regularity, and the fires that historians record are only the ones large enough to make it into the sources. Small fires, a lamp knocked over, a cooking brazier too close to dry timber, a spark from a workshop carried on the wind into a neighborhood of closely packed wooden structures, happened constantly. The Great Fire of 64 CE, during Nero's reign, destroyed large portions of the city over 9 days and left a trauma in Roman collective memory that the sources reflect clearly for generations afterward. But this was an extreme version of something Rome lived with always. The density of the city, the use of wood in construction, the presence of open flames in every home and workshop, the near impossibility of creating fire breaks in a city that had grown organically over centuries. All of this made fire an ever-present background concern. An upper-floor resident of an insula, lying in the dark and listening to the city, would have had this knowledge somewhere in their body, not as dramatic terror, not as the thought that occupied every moment, but as a background awareness, the way people who live near rivers know floods, that the night carried risks the day also carried, and that some of them were invisible until they weren't. The night was also, for some, the time of work. The bakers, as we have already seen, were up through the night. So were the cart drivers and the delivery workers who supplied the city under cover of the daylight restriction. So were the vigils themselves. So were the tavern keepers, whose establishments stayed open for those who had nowhere to be, and nothing urgent pulling them toward sleep. The taverns of Rome, the popinae and cauponae that dotted the city in numbers that suggest they were as fundamental to Roman life as bread or water, occupied a complicated cultural position. Roman literature tends to describe them with a mixture of contempt and fascination as places where the lowest kinds of society gathered, where gambling was conducted openly, where wine was drunk without the civilizing influence of proper dilution, where conversations occurred that respectable people were not supposed to be part of. Which means, of course, that respectable people were sometimes part of them. The night city attracted people who wanted to be in a city without its daytime rules, without the toga and the salutatio and the careful management of public appearance, without the social mathematics that governed who could speak to whom at what volume about what subject. In the dark, in a tavern, with enough wine and enough anonymity, different kinds of conversation became possible, different kinds of connection, different kinds of life, brief and unofficial and unrecorded, in the gaps between what Roman society officially was and what it actually contained. There were other figures in the night as well. The prostitutes who worked in the neighborhoods around the Circus Maximus and near the city gates, whose existence Roman law acknowledged with a pragmatic matter-of-factness. The fortune tellers and astrologers who set up near temples and in certain market areas, offering futures to those who needed them. The physicians who could sometimes be found at night. Rome had no organized medical system, but individuals with medical training practiced throughout the city, and illness did not keep business hours. There were also the simply sleepless, people who walked at night not because they had somewhere to go, but because the alternative, lying still with their thoughts in a room that was too hot, too crowded, too full of another person's presence, was worse than movement. A city at night, for all its dangers, offered something that a crowded room did not. Space. The space of empty streets. The space of darkness that simplified the visual world. The space of being alone, or nearly alone, in a city that was never truly alone by day. Above all of this, the stars. A Roman night sky, without electric light, was a genuinely different sky from what most modern city dwellers know. The Milky Way would have been visible on clear nights as a river of light across the darkness. Individual stars were bright enough to navigate by, and the Romans did navigate by them, on land and at sea, and in the agricultural calendars that governed when to plant and when to harvest. Roman poetry is full of the night sky. Horace wrote about it. Virgil used it. The stars were not background in the ancient world. They were present in a way that required active attention rather than occasional notice. They were named. They had stories attached to them. They governed, in the Roman understanding, the movements of time and season and fate. A person standing in a quiet Roman street at night, between the noise of the carts and the noise of the taverns, and the distant sound of the city doing what the city always did, looking up. That person would have seen something modern Romans never see. The full sky, unfiltered, brilliant, ancient, and below that sky the city continued, complicated, dangerous, alive, never fully asleep, never fully safe, always, in its difficult and magnificent way, itself. Chapter 10. Midnight in Ancient Rome. Now the city grows quieter, not silent. It never becomes silent, but quieter in the way that a living thing grows quieter when the demands of the day have finally exhausted themselves and something older and slower takes over. The taverns are still lit, but fewer people are in them. The carts are still moving, but fewer of them. The vigils make their rounds through streets that are mostly empty now, their presence more felt than seen, a quiet reassurance or a quiet threat, depending on who you were and what you had been doing. In the great houses, the dinner parties have ended. Guests have been seen off into the night, their torchbearers lighting the way home through streets that even lamplight could not fully claim. The host has retired. Servants have cleared the triclinium and begun the long restoration of the house to its daytime order. Someone is banking the kitchen fire. Someone is lowering the last lamp. In the insulae, most windows have gone dark. A few remain lit. Someone unable to sleep. Someone working through the night. Someone whose day never quite ended, because there was always one more thing, and then one more thing after that. Let us walk through this midnight city for a moment, not quickly. The way midnight deserves to be walked through, which is slowly, with attention. The paving stones are still warm from the day. In summer especially, the stone holds heat long after the air has cooled, and to touch a Roman street at midnight is to touch something that still remembers the sun, The walls rise close on either side of a narrow lane. From an upper window, no light. From another, the faint wavering of an oil lamp that has been burning since evening and may not last until morning. A dog somewhere in the distance. The distant sound of a cart on a parallel street, its rhythm familiar now, part of the city's nighttime texture. A voice, briefly, then gone. These are the sounds of Rome at midnight, not dramatic sounds, not the sounds of history being made, just the sounds of a very large number of people existing in close proximity, even in sleep. In a room near the Forum, a senator is awake. He has been lying in the dark for some time now, and sleep has not come. The events of the day, a conversation that went wrong, a political development that requires careful thinking, a letter he needs to write and hasn't yet composed. These things circulate in his mind with the particular persistence that the dark seems to give them. By day, the Forum had a way of absorbing anxiety. The movement, the faces, the noise, the sense that action was possible. All of it created a buffer between thought and feeling. At midnight, that buffer was gone. The thought and the feeling were directly adjacent to each other, with nothing in between. He would sleep eventually. He always did. But for now, he was one of the small number of midnight Romans lying awake and listening to the city breathe. In an upper room of an insula, a mother has been sleeping lightly since before midnight. Her child is beside her, breathing with the deep, unconscious ease that children sometimes achieve regardless of the temperature or the noise or the hardness of the surface beneath them. She has woken twice already. Once, at a sound she could not identify. Once, for no reason she could name. This is how she sleeps, has slept since the child was born. Part of her attention remains perpetually above sleep, monitoring, available, not quite surrendered. She adjusts the covering over the child, lies back. The sound from the street below has faded. The room is as quiet as it will be. She closes her eyes again. At the camp on the edge of the city, a soldier on watch looks out over the sleeping city. From his position, he can see more of Rome than most Romans ever see at once. The spread of rooftops, the occasional lamp still burning, the dark shapes of the great public buildings standing in their permanent silent authority, the curve of the river catching what little light there is. He has been watching for some time. Nothing has happened. Nothing will happen, in all probability. This is most of what military service actually consists of. Waiting, watching, maintaining readiness for events that do not come, carrying the obligation of vigilance through hours that turn out to require nothing from it. He is tired. He will be relieved in another hour. He looks at the city. The city does not look back. In a back room of a wealthy household, a slave sleeps, fully and completely, in the way that exhausted bodies sleep when they have been given no choice about the matter. The day has been long. The tasks have been continuous. And now, in whatever space the household structure allows, the body has claimed its few hours. This sleep is not comfortable, necessarily. The room is small. The surface is hard. The sounds of the household, even at rest, a large household makes sounds. Continue. but sleep has come anyway. The body was too spent for consciousness to hold on to, and in the sleep, whatever the day took away is, for a few hours, returned. Not freedom, not justice, not the resolution of anything, just the temporary democracy of unconsciousness. This is midnight in Rome. These are its actual contents, not the marble and the monuments, not the speeches and the triumphs, not the long abstractions of empire and history, just people, lying down, breathing, dreaming or not dreaming, waiting for morning. The city above them is unchanged. The stars, those genuinely brilliant ancient stars, undiminished by electric competition, continue their slow rotation. The Tiber moves through the dark toward the sea. The great aqueducts flow without pause, as they will all night, as they will all year, as they will for centuries. And in a million rooms across the city, a million bodies have arrived at the end of one day, and not yet reached the beginning of another. This interval, this still small space between yesterday and tomorrow, this is perhaps the truest Rome, not because it is the most important, but because it is the most human. Before history is monument, it is sleep. Before empire is architecture, it is fatigue. Before the record is written, someone in a warm room in a city that has been alive for centuries pulls a cover closer, closes their eyes, and lets the night take everything. The senator, the slave, the soldier, the mother, the child. The baker already stirring again in the dark. All of them tonight. All of them roam. And so the day ends where it must, in darkness, in breath, in the long, patient quiet of a city that has been alive for so long that it has learned how to sleep without fully stopping. We have moved through Rome from its very first moments. The bakers in the dark, the water already flowing, the slaves beginning work before the household stirred. Through the morning ceremony of the salutatio, the crowded, chaotic streets, the midday heat, and the food eaten at stone counters. Through the afternoon baths, and the 3 different lives that moved through the same city in the same hours. Through the long gold light of evening, and the dinner, formal and simple, shared and solitary, across the full distance of Roman inequality, through the dark streets and their particular risks. And now here, midnight, where all of it slows. Rome has not become simple tonight. It was never simple. It was a city of extraordinary complexity, of beauty and brutality existing side by side, of genius and injustice woven so tightly together that separating them would require unraveling the whole thing. But tonight, in the dark, it has become something close to still. And in that stillness, it has become something close to us. Because this is what sleep does across all the centuries. It returns the enormous to the human scale. It reminds us that behind every civilization, there were just people, tired people, people who wanted a softer bed and a cooler room, and one more hour before the day began again. People who worried in the dark and dreamed in the dark and reached for someone beside them in the dark. People exactly like us, So wherever you are tonight, let the city of Rome grow quiet around you. Let the lamps go out one by one. Let the streets empty. Let the stone hold its warmth a little longer before it gives it up to the night. And let yourself drift gently into the same darkness that has held every human being who ever lived. Thank you for spending this quiet time with Quiet History. Sleep well. Good night.